Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 38 of the Ask Historians podcast. So I'm really excited about this podcast because, we've had a lot of kind of European military history and politics and grand schemes and things like that, and it's just, military history is great, but I kind of needed a break from it. And while this episode does have its fair amount of it's about a revolt. So it does indeed have its own sort of military slant there, but really, it's really more about colonialism and the formations of identities and how societies can function and coalesce and come together and then break apart again, and how even in the face of adversity, you can have this persistence of a cultural identity. So keep that in mind as we go through, because I should probably tell you what we're talking about here. So today we are going to be talking about the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. So this is when a group of Pueblo people in New Mexico, Arizona, tossed out the Spanish colonialists in the late 17th century. So I'm very excited to talk about that. We'll be going through it. We'll kind of set up and kind of give you a general idea about who the Pueblo people were, where they came from, what their society was like at the time before moving into the arrival of the Spanish, and how they integrated into that society. Well, not really integrated into that society, became colonialists in that society. And then finally move into kind of the precipitating events that led to the 1680 revolt, and then the aftermath of that, which is really kind of a fascinating, decade-long period of the Spanish just simply being powerless to come back in and reestablish themselves as colonial masters. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I do.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm talking to Evan, RioAbajo, on the subreddit, and we're going to be talking about the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. So, Evan, before we get started, why don't you just go ahead and let us know what got you interested in this part of history?
Well, I'm from New Mexico originally, and I sort of heard about the Pueblo Revolt growing up through the public school system, but it was always very sort of brief. And it always kind of captured my imagination because it was this very clear counter-narrative to what we learned about colonialism, that Europeans came to the Americas and they conquered these native people, and there wasn't really any sort of resistance to that. And so that was sort of the only glimpse I had of understanding that there was resistance to colonialism by Native Americans. And so when I started doing my postgraduate research, I decided that this was a really interesting way to go because it is really a very clear example of that, even though there are other examples of resistance. And this is sort of the entryway for people to kind of understand that.
Go ahead and set the stage for us. So when we talk about the Pueblo people or the Pueblo area, who are we talking about? When are we talking about? Where are we talking about?
So the Pueblo people are a group of Native Americans in New Mexico and in Arizona today. And the origin of Pueblo identity in the present, there are still Pueblo people around, goes back to about 1300 AD. And this is when what we call Anasazi culture or ancestral Puebloan culture really kind of formed into what is modern day Pueblo culture. And what really caused that around 1300 is a mass migration of Pueblo people from where they had been living to where they're living now. Originally, the heart of the Pueblo homeland was in the Four Corners area, so border between Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. That's where they had been living, but about 1300, and this is very disputed still with archaeologists exactly why they left this area, but they did leave in mass quantities over the course of about 30 years from 1270 to 1300. The entire Four Corners region was completely abandoned. And they moved south into the Rio Grande area in New Mexico and into parts of Arizona, where the Hopi live now, and also southern Arizona and the border where the Zuni live now.
And so when they're moving, what kind of organization and structure do these groups have? Because I know the popular misconception is that, all Native Americans in North America were just these, nomadic hunter-gatherers. But are we talking about settled agricultural people?
Yeah, so Pueblo is a Spanish word for village, and this is what the Spanish called the Pueblos originally because they were living in villages, agricultural villages. And so they had been doing this for a very long time, since about 500 AD. So by the time we get up to 1300 when this is going on, they have almost a millennia of living in these sedentary agricultural villages and building these large villages out of stone and adobe mud brick.
And this is maize agriculture, right?
Yeah, so corn gets imported from Mesoamerica, and that becomes the staple diet of the Pueblo people.
Yeah, and well, this is probably actually a very separate question, but I think most people, when they know about the big marquee name in this area, is of course Chaco. So are these people related to that earlier culture?
Yeah, so Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is this sort of phenomena that encapsulates the whole region, and it is Pueblo or ancestral Pueblo. It's not what we call Pueblo yet. And so Chaco starts around 900 AD, and it kind of comes to its fruition at about 1000 AD and is over by about 1150. So that's kind of the first large scale regional system is what we call it in archaeology, just meaning that everybody in a very large area of New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado was doing things in a very similar way. They were building the same kind of architecture and they probably had very similar religious practices. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there was a king or any sort of central authority, but there was this cohesive or homogenous cultural identity. And that's sort of where everything comes out of when we start talking about actual Pueblo identity.
Yeah, so actually, you mentioned an overarching authority, a king. So what was the political organization of these I guess, well, not modern Pueblo, but these later Pueblo groups that have moved out of that area into the Rio Grande area in Arizona?
Well, so that's sort of difficult for us to figure out archaeologically, but we do think, based on the archaeological evidence, that it's probably fairly similar to how the Pueblos organized themselves at the point of contact and even up until the present. And so in modern and in more recent historic Pueblos, the religious groups in the Pueblos are the main authority. So there's these different cross-cutting religious groups. So a lot of Pueblos you'll have a moiety system where you have two groups within the Pueblo and everyone belongs to one of those groups. And usually it's a summer and a winter moiety, meaning that during the summer, so from the spring equinox to the fall equinox, the people in the spring moiety are in control of the village. And then from the fall equinox to the spring equinox, the winter moiety is in control of the village. And then you have other leadership positions that come from more restricted religious positions. So you'll have medicine societies, which only a few people will be actually members of the medicine society, and they'll know all the sort of the medicine rituals, the curing rituals. You'll have war societies, you'll have clown societies, and all these have different special religious functions, and you'll draw leadership from these societies as well. So there's kind of multiple levels from which leadership is drawn, and the whole idea is to sort of make sure that no one person has a lot of power in the village and that everybody kind of has a turn at being powerful or that multiple people have power.
Yeah, so I've heard the term acephalous society is used in mostly in relation to West Africa, but it seems like that seems appropriate to use here in the fact that it's a common identity, but one in which it's almost focused to having no central leadership, I guess you could say.
Absolutely, and there's a very strong cultural bias against people aggrandizing themselves and making themselves seem more important than anyone else. And so even though there are leaders who have potentially more power than other people, they can't really demonstrate that in a way that like a king would, where they're wearing a crown and they're decorated in gold and that sort of thing. So they do have to really emphasize that even though that they're different maybe from the rest of the group and that they have this special religious knowledge and that they do have this leadership position, they're there to help the community, and it's for the best of the community that they have that position.
And these religious leaders, they're not like secret religious leaders. They are open and known as these in these positions.
Absolutely, yeah. So the religious ceremonies they're doing are secret because only they are allowed to know the proper rituals. But there's also communal rituals that everyone can be involved in, and these religious leaders are also a part of that. So there's an element of secrecy, but for the most part, everybody knows who's in charge.
Yeah. So what are these open rituals? I guess you'd say that kind of. And I'm guessing these are basically a way to bring these kind of disparate communities together in kind of the anthropological sense of being this identity forming.
Right. So around 1300, when all these Pueblo groups or these ancestral Pueblo groups are moving into the areas where the Pueblo people live today, you get a lot of different people who are living together now because of this mass migration. So people have different religious beliefs and who have different languages they're speaking even. And there's dozens of languages spoken by Pueblo people today that aren't all necessarily mutually intelligible. So you have these huge villages around 1300 that are full of people who don't necessarily know how to get along. So you see the emergence of all these religious societies and organizations to help create that cohesive identity. And so they already have some shared identity because they're all Pueblo. They all worship in kivas, which are subterranean chambers where most of these religious rituals go on. And they all live in similar sorts of architecture and they all grow corn. But a lot of these religious rituals sort of come up around this migration to help bind everyone together into one identity.
And so when did the Spanish enter into the picture?
So the first Spanish contact in the American Southwest is in 1540 with Coronado. And so he comes through and he's looking for the seven cities of gold, for Cibola, for Gran Quivira, for all these mythical cities where there's a lot of gold, and sort of based on their experiences in central Mexico and South America, where they found a lot of silver and gold and all this wealth. And so they were hoping to find similar in New Mexico. Coronado comes in and he's very disappointed to find that there isn't really any gold because the Pueblo people never really mined gold or worked with metals in any particular way. They had some copper bells that they'd import from Mesoamerica, but for the most part, turquoise and other stones were more valuable material to them. Coronado leaves, and because he didn't find gold, the Spanish don't really take much interest in the area until the 1570s and the 1580s, so about 30 or 40 years later. And in that case, the interest is more in finding converts, Christian converts, because that's the other half of the Spanish colonial enterprise, is trying to find gold for the crown, but also trying to find converts to bring to Catholicism.
Coronado went. Was this an official, crown-sanctioned exploration? Was he going out? At what point do we say that New Mexico becomes part of New Spain, at least in a legal sense?
Well, so Coronado he did have legal backing by the Spanish throne, and so that was a expedition that was backed by the throne, but only as an exploratory mission. They weren't there to actually conquer New Mexico. They were just trying to figure out what could potentially be valuable to the crown in this area. Later expeditions found that there were all these sedentary people living in New Mexico, these Pueblo people, and that they might be good converts. And so in 1581, or 1598, excuse me, Oñate, Don Juan de Oñate, gets permission from the Spanish viceroy in New Spain to bring New Mexico into the territory and bring it under the crown. And so he takes an expedition up into New Mexico in 1598 and claims the territory for the crown. And so he claims a large area, but the area that's really under the Spanish control is basically along the Rio Grande in New Mexico and these Pueblo villages. There's nomadic groups like the Navajo and the Apache who are living outside that and who are technically part of New Spain, but really the Spanish don't have any administrative control over them.
And so I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the importation of diseases as well, because 1540, I know at least in Mesoamerica and even in northern Mexico, the 1540s are when you see our first outbreak of Cocolitzli. We've already had the importation of smallpox as well at that point. So do we have do we have disease and epidemics breaking out after this initial contact?
It's a little tricky to figure that out in New Mexico because first contact is in 1540 with Coronado, but then the next Spanish contact is in the 1570s. So we have this 30-year gap where we don't have any historical records. So all we have is the archaeological evidence to talk about disease. And it looks like there was probably some sort of epidemic disease introduced that really impacted the populations, but it doesn't look like it was quite as devastating as it was in other parts of the New World. Yes. Part of that might just be because the population density is lower, but we're really not totally sure.
Yeah, but we're not looking at this kind of 89% population loss with massive reorganization of society.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the base of Pueblo society is still pretty much the same, but villages do tend to be a little smaller by the end of the 16th century as opposed to the beginning. So there does seem to be some demographic decline.
Tell us how the Spanish really, their actual authority is fairly confined to this small area, but how do they establish their authority in the region?
Well, it was actually fairly bloodless at the beginning. So Oñate comes in and he makes this tour of all the pueblos along the Rio Grande, And they basically say, yeah, we'll swear fealty to the crown. We don't want any trouble, that sort of thing. And so to begin with, it's not really too difficult of a situation. But as time goes on, in the first couple of years that they've established authority, the Pueblo people sort of realize kind of what they've bought into as far as being Spanish subjects. And some of them are okay with that, and some of them really don't like it. So the first big conflict with the Spanish is a few years after Oñate conquers the territory. He sends some emissaries to the Pueblo of Akima, which is famous as a fortress pueblo because it's built on top of a mesa, and so you have to climb up these steep cliffs to get to it. And he sends these emissaries because they've stopped paying tribute, and one of them is his nephew. And the Akima kill his nephew along with all the other people they sent as sort of defiance against the Spanish. And so he ends up sieging the city and conquering it in a very bloody way. And famously, he cuts off the feet of one of the feet of all the males in the village. And so that's sort of the first kind of episode of resistance toward the Spanish, and also sort of Spanish brutality also.
So what were the demands the Spanish were making that were causing these groups like the Yakima to cease paying tribute? I mean, what was the tribute being collected here?
So the Spanish sort of organized the territory a lot like they did in other parts of the New World, where they brought everybody into missions. And so that was their main effort in going to New Mexico, was to missionize these people, turn them Christian. They established all these missions where they would take multiple towns of Pueblo people and all bring them together at that one mission site, a big cathedral and a priest there. And that would be their sort of main attempt to Christianize them. But part of that is that the Pueblo people who were living there had to work to build the church and to feed the priests and the Spaniards there. And they always had to pay tribute as well to the crown every year. And that was sort of through the secular administration of the colony in Santa Fe. So you have all these missions sort of out in the countryside, and then you have the town of Santa Fe, which is now the capital of New Mexico, which was established as sort of the secular capital of New Mexico, where all the Spanish immigrants mostly lived. And you also have these encomenderos. So the encomienda system was a system where the Spanish would give favored subjects access to native labor. So basically, you would be a Spaniard coming to New Mexico, and you would set up a ranch somewhere along the Rio Grande, and you would be given a certain number of Pueblo people whose labor was yours for a part of the year, and which you could use to grow crops or cattle, anything else, in part of your economic system.
When Oñate is putting down this rebellion, this early rebellion, I guess you could say, is this him using Spanish troops and Spanish and Spaniards alone, or is he helped along with other Pueblo people in the region?
So a little bit of both. There's not a lot of Spaniards ever in New Mexico until very much later. So at this point, he doesn't have enough Spanish troops to put this down. So he recruits warriors from other Pueblo groups to help him, but also they initially brought with them Mesoamerican allies, indigenous people from Mesoamerica, who they call Tlaxcalans, but we're not totally sure if they actually are or not. But yeah, he brings these.
It's a long way from Tlaxcala at this point.
Yes, exactly. So it's a long way to go, but we do know that he has indigenous people from Mexico with him that he brought with him as additional troops. So they're probably part of this as well.
So we have these reorganization of settlements around, into, I guess, what we would now call like the mission system.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned earlier that the positions of both temporal and religious authority were the ones that were kind of the heads of the society. So how does mission system start to infringe upon that?
Well, so it has a very direct impact since all the Pueblo leaders are drawn from these religious societies. When the Spanish come in and they ban that practice of traditional Pueblo religion, those leaders in some ways become disenfranchised because they can't practice what had given them a social position before, that religious power. So they have to take that underground, and they still practice those religious beliefs, but they can't do it inside of the Spanish. And so the Spanish start designating secular leaders, caciques they call them, for each village. And they pick these out of individuals within the village. And usually they would be people who had some sort of authority beforehand anyways. They couldn't just pick anybody and set them up. But a lot of times they tried to avoid the overtly religious leaders because they didn't want to promote that. They really wanted everybody to convert to Christianity. And so having a secular leader on the side really helped accomplish that.
And do we see the kind of mass destruction of religious icons and outfits and uniforms and other kind of religious iconography and items as well?
Yeah, so that's a little more tricky to figure out from the archaeological record and also from the historic record, because they don't necessarily always write down when they've gone through and done these sorts of purges of idolatry and sorcery is usually how they refer to it. For the most part, it seems like whenever they could find religious paraphernalia and objects used for Pueblo religious ceremonies, they would destroy them. And for the most part, they had the kivas, these important religious buildings, filled in and burned down and destroyed. And so people do continue to practice these beliefs, but it's very much in secret and not necessarily in the same kinds of context that they would have before. So they'll be doing it inside houses instead of in these special religious buildings.
So what would happen if they were caught or exposed practicing sorcery?
We do have a lot of examples of people being tried as sorcerers or devil worshippers throughout this sort of 17th century, this mission period. And what would happen is generally they would be executed for devil worship and for sorcery. And a lot of times these executions were for people who were leading large-scale revolts of some sort. So you do have a lot of revolts before the 1681 coming out of even a couple different villages getting together and trying to either stop paying tribute or extract something else from the Spanish, some sort of concession from the Spanish. And so a lot of these are led by these religious leaders because that's who the leadership was in traditional Pueblo society. And so the Spanish sort of conflate this with the fact that these religious leaders are also leaders of the society as a whole, with sort of a backslide into idolatry and devil worship. And so they do try the leaders of the revolt as devil worshippers and have them executed. And so that serves two purposes in that it puts down the revolt by killing the leadership, and it also really enforces the fact that Christianity is the new norm, and this is what everybody needs to kind of come around to.
And it sounds like also that there's kind of a disparate spread of Christianity here. So it seems like some groups are trying to hold on to this traditional Pueblo religion, while others, I would guess, would be adopting Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it varies from Pueblo village to Pueblo village. Some were more sympathetic to the Spanish or to Christianity. Some were not. And even within villages, you get divides. So at Pecos Pueblo, there's a very famous divide. There's a huge cathedral that was built there because it was one of the more populous pueblos. And there's a lot of the village is clustered around this cathedral, but then there's a whole other part of the village that's built very far away from the cathedral. And we know from the documentary record that these two sorts of villages within one were very much kind of pro-Spanish and anti-Spanish. And so even within that village, there's that divide.
Does that divide why we saw these earlier acts of I guess, resistance to the Spanish, but it didn't seem like they were particularly particularly widespread or organized?
Right. So a big part of the problem is that isn't any tradition of central authority with the pueblos, as we were talking about earlier. Every village is sort of autonomous, and you do have several villages that may speak the same language and generally practice the same sort of religion, and they'll have a lot of exchange with each other, but there's no central authority. So any sort of rebellion is going to basically include one or two or maybe a couple more villages, but not the entirety of the sort of Pueblo world and the Pueblo people.
So set the stage for us for the lead up to this larger scale 1680 revolt. Then, what were the specific grievances we have then, or is it a continuation of this not wanting to pay tribute?
Well, so a lot of it is the tribute. There's a lot of documentary records of Pueblo people starving, especially in the early periods of Spanish rule, because the tribute demands were so heavy on them that they were giving them a lot of their food, and they had to feed all these new people who weren't actually growing any food. And so that really put a burden on Pueblo societies to feed themselves, and they went through kind of this period of hardship. And that's true later as well, but once they kind of accommodate the agricultural system, it's less of a problem. So the tribute demands are an issue. They're tired of having their labor being forced and used by these encomenderos and these priests for a part of the year. And a bigger problem is the religious persecution. So that continues, despite having been ruled by the Spanish for almost a century at the point of the 1680 revolt. There's still a lot of native Pueblo religion going on. This is a constant back and forth between the Spanish trying to enforce Christianity, but also not incite full-scale revolution by cracking down too hard on the religious aspects. And so in 1675, you get sort of the event that leads up to the Pueblo Revolt. And in this, you had 47 religious leaders, Pueblo religious leaders, who were captured by the Spanish, and they were tried for sorcery. They were accused of trying to conspire and place curses on Christian subjects, including Christian Indians. And so out of all these trials, 4 of them get executed, and then the remaining 43 end up being imprisoned by the Spanish in Santa Fe. And so what really sort of kicks off the revolt is that a group of Pueblo warriors, and this is from the Spanish side, so we don't know which Pueblos these warriors came from or who organized them, but this group of warriors shows up in Santa Fe and they sort of storm the capital and they demand that the governor release these prisoners. And the governor doesn't want to have this fight, and he's concerned about whether or not they can win it. They're basically being held at weapon point. They agree to release the prisoners. And that sort of diffuses the situation for the time being, but it does give the Pueblos an idea that they can sort of enforce their demands on the Spanish and that they do have some sort of leverage in that negotiation.
This 1675, these 47 Pueblo religious leaders, I mean, it sounds like this was an unprecedented rounding up of quote-unquote sorcerers. Or was this de rigueur, or was it more like past, they'd done a guy here, a guy there, kind of thing like that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much unusual. Most of the sort of crackdowns they had in the past, they would kill maybe 3 or 4 people or arrest people and try them. Just a few number of people who may have been at the head of some sort of small revolt or who they had caught with particular sort of religious objects, with idols, they would call them. And so in this case, the sheer number of people they arrested is really kind of out of scale of what they had done. And so that sort of invites this response from the Pueblos that is also out of scale from what they had previously done.
Do we know why the Spanish kind of, I guess you could really just say, overreached in this case?
Well, that's sort of difficult because they don't really talk a lot in the records about what their intention was in arresting so many people, other than that they had the information about them as being religious leaders and that they could do it, really. And so it was sort of more of an attempt to increase their control over these religious practices because, as I said, they'd already been going for almost a century at this point, sort of back and forth trying to quash these religious practices. They really were trying to up their game and try and really put an end to it finally.
Yeah, and I mean, and I would guess that on paper, this is something they should have been doing since day one anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the mandate is that Christianity is the only sort of allowed religion, and so they're really, to be fair, a little bit more lenient than they should have been, just because the political situation didn't allow them to crack down as hard as they would really want to.
These religious leaders are then released from Santa Fe, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so what is? I mean, do they immediately go home and start formulating ideas of? I mean, I guess the question would be really what were their goals? Was it to drive the Spanish out completely, or was it really to just kind of mitigate the labor and tribute demands?
Well, so what happens is one of these religious leaders is named Pope, and he's what we think of probably a priest, but maybe a lieutenant of some sort from the Pueblo of Akima, which is in northern New Mexico. And he is sort of the main organizer of the revolt. And there's other people involved, but he's the one who sort of brings this vision of driving the Spanish out to the rest of the Pueblos. And so he's one of these people who was captured. And once he's released, he goes north to Taos Pueblo, which is sort of on the very northern end of Spanish control. So it's sort of more able to get away with these kinds of native religious practices because they're far away from Santa Fe. He goes into sort of prayer and meditation in Akiva there, and he receives this vision from one of the powerful Pueblo spirits who tells him that if the Pueblo people band together, they can drive out the Spanish. And if they do that, they can go back to living the way that their forefathers had and practice their religious beliefs, and they won't starve anymore, and they'll have a better life. And so it's very much a revitalization movement. It's less of a sort of political revolt in the way we think about a rebellion, and more of a sort of a religious movement where if we drive out the newcomers, we can go back to how things were, and we'll be able to restore the order of the religious order and the social order that we had.
And so I know, at least from my experience with Mesoamerica, that there's a lot of kind of being the embodiment of a particular deity. And I know also in kind of some of the later interactions with Native Americans in North America, there's also this kind of person is the embodiment of a particular spirit or something. So do we have Popé coming out of this meditation, I guess you could say, saying that he is he carrying forth a vision, or is he kind of becoming the avatar of this kind of spirit revitalization?
Well, so it's a little bit of both in that Pueblo society, the religious beliefs, they very much have this idea of people kind of embodying various spirits and other supernaturals for a period of time. And that's part of a lot of the rituals. But in this case, it's really more Pope's received this vision from the spirits, and he's sort of been appointed as the figurehead or the speaker for the spirits, and he's the one who's carrying that vision to everybody. So he's not claiming necessarily any supernatural status, but he is claiming a privileged status as far as having received this vision.
So how does he begin communicating this vision to? I guess he would target other religious leaders or other people in various pueblos who are positions of authority.
Absolutely. And so what he does is he sort of takes a tour of all the pueblos and kind of spreads this message to them. And he does target these other religious leaders because despite all these pueblos speaking different languages and having sort of different religious beliefs, a lot of the religious societies are actually very similar between them. So, for instance, we know that the medicine society, which is present at most pueblos and is where a lot of the religious leadership and the secular leadership comes from, those societies sort of started in a handful of pueblos and were sort of exported to the other ones back around that sort of 1300, 1400 time period when these were really getting to started going. And so they're very similar despite being in different pueblos in different areas. That kind of gives Popé the ability to communicate with these other religious leaders on similar terms because they are part of essentially what is the same sort of religious society.
Yeah,
and so he goes to those
he
people.
knows the secret handshake, the passcode.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so that's sort of why it's been hotly debated what kind of religious society he was a part of, because that would influence, who he could kind of contact and who he would organize for this revolt.
As he's going along, I mean, is this something that the Spanish are aware of? Are they keeping tabs on him, or is he doing this in secret? Is he doing this in open?
He's doing this very much in secret because he doesn't want the Spanish to know. He wants to take them by surprise. And the Spanish do sort of coming nearer to when the revolt actually is going to happen. They do get some hint that there's a rebellion brewing, but they've had this happen before and they're not too concerned, especially because the reports they're getting are about the sort of the mass scale of the Pueblo Revolt where it's including all the pueblos. And so they don't really believe that that's something that could happen. All their previous experience with rebellions have been on sort of the village level or between a couple villages. They don't really believe that something like that could happen. And that's what kind of lulls them into complacency.
How is Popé, who I assume is still leading, at this point, how is Popé actually, what is the logistics of organizing here?
Well, so once he sort of gets everyone on board with being part of this revolt, which isn't, and not everyone is on board. He does have to do a lot of browbeating and sort of threatening and coercing to get people to join. He sends out runners to all the pueblos with knotted strings. And so each string had the same number of knots on it, and every day the runner would undo one knot. And so when you undid the last knot, that would be the day for everybody to revolt. So that's how they were coordinating this. And this is actually where things get a little tricky for them because two of the runners are captured by the Spanish 2 days before the revolt. They kind of spill the beans to the Spanish, and they have to sort of initiate the revolt early because Popé's concerned that once he hears that they were captured, he's concerned that the Spanish are going to move against them. They're going to lose their element of surprise. And so they end up on August 12th is when they had planned on doing the revolt, but they actually end up starting it on August 10th.
And how does it get started? What is their initial target, I guess you could say?
Well, so it sort of starts within the villages themselves, and basically all the villages who had kind of agreed to be part of the revolt, they kill the priest at the village, or try to, whatever priests and soldiers and Spaniards were in the village, they kill them or humiliate them in some way, and they generally sort of burn down the churches or otherwise desecrate these churches, although not all of them. Some of them sort of just shut the doors and kind of leave them be. And a couple of the priests and other rancheros who are kind of living in the rural areas, they end up managing to escape, but they sort of start at the local level, killing the priests and the encomenderos. And then once they've done that, and this is all sort of on the first day, and a couple of the pueblos that are farther away take a little while longer to hear that the revolt got moved up, right? And so they kind of revolt on the day they were supposed to. But since they're farther away, the Spanish still are kind of unaware of what's going on. And so once they've taken care of sort of the local Spanish, they come together at Santa Fe, which is the secular capital where the governor is, and the the Pueblo groups closest to Santa Fe, arrive there with their warriors, and they basically lay siege to the city. And so they kind of go back and forth on the outskirts of the city for a few days, and then at that point, more Pueblo warriors arrive who were from places that were farther away. And so now the Spanish are really outnumbered, and they're really having a hard time. So they get driven back into the governor's palace in Santa Fe. And so basically, all the Spaniards in Santa Fe and all their livestock are living in this small palace together under siege. And they have water, but for the most part, they're really crowded. They have all this livestock with them. It's not a good situation. There's kids and women in there who they want to get out, and the Pueblos are surrounding them. And the Pueblos actually take control of the cathedral in Santa Fe also, and start ringing the bell just incessantly to kind of drive them out.
What are the Pueblo using in terms of armament at this point? Have they adopted Spanish weaponry? Are they, because this is a revitalization movement, are they using kind of traditional weaponry?
Well, they're really using whatever they can get a hold of, but there's just not a lot of steel weaponry in New Mexico at that time, and most of it's controlled by the Spanish military, most of which is in Santa Fe. Really, they're using mostly bows and arrows, as well as anything else they can sort of get a hold of. War clubs are sort of popular. Really, the big thing is it's a lot of ranged warfare. So despite the Spanish having some guns with them, these still aren't the best guns. We're talking 1680. They don't have a lot of them, and they're not the best guns. And they do have some crossbows with them. But really, it's a lot of ranged warfare between the archers, the Pueblo archers, and these Spanish crossbowmen and musketeers. And so, really, the Pueblo advantage is their numbers compared to the Spanish. And the Spanish just really don't. The technology is not equalizing that difference.
So the Spanish are basically under siege in the governor's palace. Have they sent word out? Who could they actually send word out to in terms of asking for relief or help?
Well, so that's sort of the tricky part is how they planned the revolt, which was very successful on their part. Is they sort of killed everybody outside the capital and then surrounded it. So basically, there was nobody left in New Mexico to help them. And so the nearest Spanish outpost would be El Paso, which is several weeks away from Santa Fe. So they were pretty much entirely isolated, and there was no way for them to get word out to anybody to come help them, at least any reasonable amount of time.
And who is in charge of the Spanish at this point?
So the governor is named Odermin. That's his last name, and he's the governor of New Mexico, and he's there in Santa Fe, and he's the one sort of leading the siege defense. And so eventually, he decides that they're going to die if they just stay there under siege. They can't really fight back against the Pueblos. So what he does is he organizes a break. He sort of takes the Spanish military and uses it to carve a path through the sieging Pueblos and escape with a lot of the civilians as well. And the Pueblos, for the most part, don't put up a lot of resistance to this. They sort of let him go because it's sort of a tacit defeat, right? They're admitting defeat by abandoning the capital. And so they sort of let them go, and Odermin and the rest of the Spanish make this long march down south along the Rio Grande. And as they go south, they encounter a couple of the Pueblos that hadn't joined at Santa Fe, joined the other Pueblos at Santa Fe, but who are also wanting to fight them. But since there's such smaller numbers, they actually end up capturing a lot of these Pueblos and forcing them south on the march with them. And so eventually they make it back to El Paso and sort of Odermin sets up his governance in exile there, because he's still claiming to be governor of New Mexico, even though he has zero political control and military control over New Mexico itself.
How do the Pueblo under Pope, how do they, I guess you could say, celebrate their victory?
Well, so Pope sort of sets himself up as this pan-Pueblo leader, because a lot of what he's sort of promoting as this vision is this idea of shared Pueblo identity. Because before the Spanish, they did all have sort of similar religious beliefs, and some of them spoke similar language, and they all kind of lived in a similar way, but they didn't necessarily have a sense of a shared identity. And so when the Spanish came, they kind of all lumped them together as Pueblo people, and that's where we get the term in the first place. And so out of that sort of Spanish perception of them being one people, Pope kind of turns that back on the Spanish and says, yeah, we are all one people, and we're all going to rebel against you at once. And so he's really pushing for that kind of pan-Pueblo identity. And so as part of that, he does this tour of all the Pueblos after the Spanish have left. And he really pushes everybody to kind of eliminate any trace of the Spanish. So burn down all the churches, break all the altars, that kind of thing. and go back to living in the way that they had, and building kivas and planting their corn and having the same sort of religious practices. And then a lot of the Pueblos, they're living at these mission settlements, and a lot of them, they just leave the mission settlements and go build new villages elsewhere because they don't want to be living next to these churches that were kind of symbols of Spanish power over them. So we see in this sort of short 10-year period after 1680, a lot of new villages are built in New Mexico. And we see this archaeologically. So you get all these new villages and all these abandonment of all these mission villages.
And so, I mean, of course, we talked about earlier how some Pueblo had actually converted to Christianity. So were there, I guess you could say, persecutions in kind of a turnabout from the Spanish to persecutions of Christianized Pueblos?
Well, so a lot of the really devout Christian Pueblo people went with the Spanish. They sort of left with them as part of that whole dynamic. But on the other hand, a lot of them were really sort of browbeaten and coerced into returning to traditional beliefs and sort of exactly what sort of the Spanish were doing. There's an anecdote from one of the Pueblos where we have record of they dragged the priest out of the cathedral and they were going to kill him. But one of the neophytes, the Pueblo neophytes who had been training under him, sort of stood up to defend him, like, don't kill him, just let him go. And the Pueblos forced him to kill the priest as sort of an act of, okay, I'm renouncing Christianity and I'm going back to our traditional beliefs. And so there definitely was that turnabout as sort of really trying to eliminate a lot of the Christian influence. Although there were still groups who were sympathetic to the Spanish and to Christianity. And so in a couple cases like Pecos, they managed to sort of smuggle out the priests before they were killed because they had word that the Pueblo Revolt was going to happen. And so they knew enough ahead of time that they could actually save the priests there.
But of course, at this point, Pope is, setting himself up as something that really, I guess you'd say, hasn't actually existed in the Pueblo culture beforehand. So, how successful is he at building this, not just this, uniform blanket Pueblo identity, but that Pueblo identity with himself at the top of it?
It doesn't last very long because, as you really rightly note, this is totally foreign to what Pueblo people had been doing previously. They weren't about strong central leaders. And so him setting himself up that way and sort of dictating to other villages what they can do and what they have to do and sort of what their vision for revitalization is, that really strikes a lot of people in the wrong way. And it really is more reminiscent of what the Spanish were doing than any sort of Pueblo leadership. And so that's sort of the irony of the whole situation is he's preaching this revitalization movement, but how he's going about it is really kind of latching onto this pan-Pueblo identity the Spanish had given them, and also kind of setting himself up in a very despotic Spanish way as opposed to in a Pueblo way.
So, I mean, were there internal resistance to him? You said, I think you mentioned that he was in power for 10 years. I mean, did he have his own internal rebellions to deal with, I guess?
He does actually get deposed at some point. After about 2 or 3 years in this sort of position of despotic power, his lieutenants, his war chiefs, sort of decide, well, this isn't really how we do things, and so they kind of they don't force lock him up in a dungeon or kill him or anything, but they kind of say, no, we're not supporting your kind of claim to power anymore. We're not going to do this, and so everything starts to kind of fragment after that point. There's not that strong central leadership anymore. All the pueblos that kind of had been organized under Pope start kind of doing their own thing again and sort of having their own leadership and electing their own leadership amongst themselves.
And what are the Spanish doing at this point? What's taking them, all these years to come back?
Well, so Odermin really wants to reconquer New Mexico because, of course, it's a huge stain on his sort of image and kind of the Spanish image that they could be kicked out of their own colony, right? In 1681, tries to reconquer New Mexico, and he organizes a group of Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies at El Paso, and he sort of marches up the Rio Grande, and he gets to the first pueblo in New Mexico at that point that's still occupied, which is Isleta Pueblo, which is still occupied today, and he fights them, and initially they sort of start lobbing arrows at him from the walls of the village, but at a certain point they kind of send out emissaries and say, well, maybe we're hasty, we'd like to not fight you, but that negotiation kind of breaks down and they have this battle. And the Spanish win, because it's just one Pueblo village against this entire Spanish army. But what happens is they take so many losses and they realize how much effort it's going to be to conquer every single village one by one, that Odermin just understands that he doesn't have the resources to do that. he basically makes a retreat after that point. So he burns down this sort of one village. He sends some scouts ahead to kind of get an idea of what's going on up north, but he basically says, we don't have the resources to conquer New Mexico. If they're going to resist us, unlike when Oñate came in at first and they sort of peaceably accepted annexation, they just don't have the resources to commit to actually conquer New Mexico.
So I guess at that point, Pyrrhic victory achieved, he goes back to El Paso? What
Absolutely, yeah. He sort of retreats to
to
El Paso, and he dies a few years later. And so a new governor is appointed, whose name is Diego de Vargas. At that point, he has the same sort of, he's a governor of a territory he doesn't control, and so he's really interested in capturing that again. And so he organizes another military expedition, and this is in 1692. He comes back in, and at this point, so when Odomín came back in, there was still this, Pope was still around, there was still this cooperation between all the pueblos. So he realized he's not going to be able to sort of militarily conquer all of New Mexico. But in 1692, Pope is no longer in power. The pueblos are really kind of fragmented. Some of them are fighting amongst themselves. You also have the problem of additional raids by Apaches and Navajo and Utes and these other nomadic groups who are kind of pressuring the pueblos from the north and the west. There's a lot more fragmentation, a lot of factionalism, and de Vargas comes into this situation and is basically able to reconquer New Mexico without any bloodshed. It's very famously sort of quoted as a bloodless reconquest, although we really don't like using that term anymore, historians or archaeologists, because there was a lot of bloodshed in the subsequent years to his reconquest. It's just that when he returned to New Mexico and returned to Santa Fe, no one was really in a position to fight him.
That brings me to my next question. So, did the Spanish enact a sort of retribution upon the Pueblo at this point?
Well, so de Vargas was, despite being very cruel in some aspects, he really cracked down on a lot of the revolts that happened after 1692, because up until about 1700, there were multiple sort of secondary Pueblo revolts, people trying to do again what they had already done and kick the Spanish out. But these were all smaller scale. They never had the same level of cooperation they did in the Pueblo Revolt. And so de Vargas was able to kind of put them down. But another factor contributing to that, other than him being very sort of heavy-handed with those revolts, was that he sort of instituted more leniency than they had. So on the part of the Franciscan friars who were sort of managing the mission system and the secular government, they were very much more lenient towards Pueblo religious practices. They sort of turned a blind eye to a lot of them. As long as they were sort of understanding that as long as you didn't do it in front of us, we'll let you practice that way. And as long as you sort of come to church still and kind of, make this effort at having a Christian appearance, we'll let you do that.
Yeah, show up on Sunday. We don't care what you do on Saturday.
Exactly. And there's actually a really great example of that no one has really great explanation for, but at Pecos, again, the cathedral there, they rebuild the cathedral when they come back because it was burned down, the first one. But at the same time they rebuild the cathedral, there's a kiva built right in the courtyard of the cathedral, which is a pretty big sort of slap in the face to the Spanish that you can have this Pueblo religious building right in front of this, cathedral. And the fact that they allowed that is something sort of astonishing, especially considering what had happened before the revolt.
So I just wonder, I think the fate of Pope, actually, I think is kind of still up in the air here.
Yes. So that's something that unfortunately the historic records don't really talk about, and we don't really have any oral history about what happened to him. As far as we know, he sort of just dies in obscurity sometime around the reconquest of de Vargas. And so he's kind of around to see everything kind of come crashing back down, but he doesn't really have any, because he was deposed back in the sort of the beginning of the revolt, he doesn't really have any political clout to kind of oppose the Spanish conquest again.
So with this, the kiva built in front of the cathedral, do we also see a kind of modification of the material attribute and the labor demands as well?
Absolutely. So the encomienda system is over. They don't reinstitute that when they come in. So there's no longer Spanish ranchers who have access to Pueblo labor through that, because they realized that was a huge sticking point beforehand, and so they don't want to force that again. And there's still tribute that has to be paid to the crown, but they very much sort of ease off on that, and they do respect a lot of the Pueblo claims to land and what sort of they claim as their own agricultural land and their own produce. So they do still have tribute that they're getting from them, but it's very much reduced. And they do sort of acknowledge a lot more of the rights of the Pueblo people to farm their own land and produce their own goods.
And do we have these reorganizations around missions as well? Does that come back?
Well, so the sort of mission system is mostly abolished. You still have missions where people are brought in, but the idea of having all the pueblos living at missions is sort of abandoned as well, because they realized that was another huge issue, is having them living in this regimented system where their sort of every waking hour is controlled by the mission bells. And there's a lot of great evidence that during the revolt, one of the items that really drew most of their ire were the mission bells. They would break these, they would castrate them, which is their own words, by removing the knocker from the middle of the bell. So kind of make them impotent, because for most of this period before the revolt, they're living in these mission systems where they have to wake up when the bell chimes, they have to go to prayer when the bell chimes, they have to go work in the fields when the bell chimes. And so it's sort of a symbol of Spanish control over their own labor. And so they don't really reinstitute that mission system because of that.
I mean, with the lightening all these burdens, and I guess you could just kind of say a lighter touch by the Spanish here. Do we still, even though it was kind of breaking down, even with Pope in charge, do we see this continuation of a common Pueblo identity? Because I mean, we're still talking about the Pueblo people right now.
Absolutely. And so the Pueblo people today do kind of recognize that despite being different, they're all sort of part of one, maybe wouldn't call it an ethnic group necessarily, but one society, one culture. That really does come out of this period, because that's not something that you see ever before that. And it is really the result of the Pueblo Revolt, having this idea of pan-Pueblo identity. And a lot of the Pueblo people today kind of look to the revolt as the sort of key instance of cultural preservation in their history. So they think of it as they were on this downslide with Spanish beforehand, trying to kind of make them Spanish, make them Christian. And after that, the leniency given to them by the Spanish, and then later also in the American period, kind of carrying over from that, is what allowed them to preserve their culture. And that's kind of the story that they tell today.
Well, Evan, thank you for walking us through the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. Do you have any kind of concluding remarks you want to make on the subject?
Well, I just really think it's an important event for people to understand, because it does kind of illustrate that colonialism in the Americas, this very much intricate process that had a lot of different ways it could manifest. Understanding that not everybody kind of was just rolled over by the Spanish, and that there was a lot of agency that Native people had in sort of negotiating their situation with the colonial authorities, despite still being colonized people. That's sort of what this kind of tells us, is that they did have a lot more power than maybe they're given credit for in sort of popular history.
Well, Evan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you for listening. I hope my rambling at the beginning of this episode, that little bumper I put at the beginning, kind of echoed through your mind as we talked about the Pueblo Revolt and its ramifications, particularly because I think Evan's point at the end there was that this was really a transformative moment where this introduction of an outside force allowed, partially by the way this outside force saw them, but also the way they had to actually kind of come together and unify against it, helped to form this kind of solid Pueblo identity. And that in itself, and then that the removal of that kind of oppressive colonial force was able to give them a kind of the breather room and the I guess you could say the leverage to maintain that identity, which is an interesting and I wouldn't go so far as to say unique in the history of the colonizations of the Americas, but it certainly is a less common event than we would see in across the two continents that European settlers moved into. And I think it speaks a lot to kind of partially the reason why there is such a strong still kind of native identity in the Four Corners area as well. Not to mention the fact that it's just home to some of the most amazing archaeological sites in the Americas for pre-Columbian people. So if you ever are around that area, please do go check out the Chaco Canyon area and some of the pueblos around there that are just fantastic archaeological sites. But we're getting off topic. So coming up next week, we're going to return to military history. In a way, we will be talking to Bernardito about, it's going to be a two-parter. We're actually going to start by talking about the French experience in Indochina, so the French Indochina War, the kind of the beginning of post-colonialization and the beginnings of, really our focus is going to be kind of on the counterinsurgency tactics that developed from there. So we'll start with the French in Indochina and the Indochinese War, and then we will move into the French in Algeria and the Algerian War, which is has some very notable echoes throughout history that we'll cover. So I hope you'll come back and tune in for both of those episodes. It'll be very exciting. Bernardita was an excellent guest with a lovely accent too. But again, I digress. So again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you enjoy the show. If you do, feel free to write a review or, click 5 stars or whatever it is on iTunes. Tell some friends, tell some buddies, tell your dog. Anyway, tell some people so they'll know what you're talking about when you decide to go off on a long discourse on the formation of identity in, colonial era revolts. So until then, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.